What happens when an elderly woman, simply admiring a piece of jewelry, is wrongly accused of stealing? In a high-end store where trust should be a given, Ruth's quiet visit turns into a nightmare of humiliation, only for a shocking twist to reveal a hidden strength. You won't believe how this unfolds. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished floor of Golden Grace Jewelers, a quiet jewelry shop in Portland, Maine. Inside, the store gleamed with an array of sparkling rings, necklaces and bracelets, each piece more dazzling than the last. The soft hum of the store's ambient music blended with the occasional chime of the front door, creating an air of calm elegance. Margaret, a woman in her late 70s with silver curls neatly tucked beneath a beret, stepped inside with a familiar smile on her face, the kind of smile that came from years of love and pride. Her worn leather purse rested gently on her shoulder, a sign of a life lived with purpose and simplicity. Margaret wasn't just another customer. She was the mother of Thomas, the owner of the store. She had watched her son pour his heart into this business, transforming it from a small, humble shop to one of the most respected in town. Every time Margaret walked through the doors, she felt a surge of pride. This was Thomas's dream made real, and she was part of it all. She had always found comfort in coming by unannounced, bringing him lunch from his favorite cafe, a small tradition they shared. It gave her a sense of closeness, watching him in his element, interacting with customers and staff, seeing how far he had come. Today, however, things were different. Thomas was out for a meeting with a supplier, as Margaret learned from a quick chat with the Lisa at the front desk. But that didn't deter her. Margaret didn't mind waiting. The store, after all, was a second home to her, and she could spend hours browsing the displays, letting her thoughts wander. Her fingers lightly brushed the glass cases as she moved between aisles, admiring the diamonds and precious stones that gleamed under the soft lighting. As she moved closer to one display, something caught her eye. A pair of diamond earrings that reminded her of a set she had owned many years ago. Back then, they had been a gift, a symbol of better times before life's trials and tribulations forced her to sell them. The memory of those days flooded back, and for a brief moment, Margaret felt a wave of nostalgia. As she bent closer to the display, her fingers grazed the edge of the stand, accidentally tipping one of the earrings. It fell to the floor with a faint clink, a sound that startled her. Her heart skipped a beat as she bent down to retrieve it, feeling a slight embarrassment despite the fact that no one seemed to notice. But then the sharp click of high heels echoed behind her, and Margaret turned, looking up in surprise as a tall, stern-faced saleswoman stood over her. The woman's cold gaze and the lack of warmth in her expression immediately struck Margaret as odd. She wasn't familiar with this woman, and something about her presence felt off. "I'm so sorry, dear," Margaret said, standing up slowly, holding the earring delicately in her hand. "I just wanted a closer look. These earrings remind me of a pair I once—" But before she could finish her sentence, the saleswoman interrupted her, cutting her off with a glare that sent a chill down Margaret's spine. "What do you think you're doing?" the woman snapped, her tone sharp and accusatory. Margaret was taken aback by the saleswoman's sudden hostility, her body freezing for a brief moment. She had never encountered this kind of treatment before, especially not in her son's store, a place that had always been a reflection of their family's values. Her hands trembled slightly, still holding the earring as she tried to process the sharpness in the woman's voice. "I was just admiring it," Margaret said softly, offering the earring back to the saleswoman. "There's no harm in looking, dear." But the woman's cold eyes narrowed, her stance defensive and aggressive. Margaret, though startled, remained calm, her experience in life having taught her the importance of composure in moments of tension. Still, she could feel the unease rising inside her. Something wasn't right. "You think you can just pick it up and pocket it?" the saleswoman sneered, her voice laced with disdain. She stepped closer, her presence imposing, as she made Margaret feel smaller with each passing second. Margaret shook her head, confusion turning to disbelief. "I've done no such thing. I was just picking it up because it fell." The woman wasn't listening. Her eyes raked over Margaret from head to toe, taking in the modest coat, the worn purse, and the silver curls that spoke of years lived humbly. Margaret felt the sting of judgment in the air, an undercurrent of something cruel beneath the woman's words. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," Margaret said, her voice trembling but firm. She held out the earring, her hand shaking slightly, trying to make sense of the situation. But the saleswoman didn't take the earring back. Instead, she snatched it out of Margaret's hand with such force that it left Margaret stunned. "Save your excuses," the woman spat. "I'm calling the police. You're not getting away with this." Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. Her mind raced as she tried to comprehend what was happening. She had done nothing wrong, nothing to deserve this kind of treatment. She was the mother of the owner, for goodness sake. This was supposed to be her son's safe haven. Yet here she was, standing accused of theft, humiliated and helpless. "Oh, please," Margaret pleaded, feeling the walls close in around her. "There's no need for the police." But the woman was already dialing her phone, speaking to the dispatcher with unnerving calmness. The words she spoke cut through the air like a sharp blade. "Yes, we have a thief here at Golden Grace Jewelers," she said, her voice echoing ruthlessly. "She's still here. I've detained her." Detained. The word hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Margaret felt her chest tighten, the weight of it pressing on her lungs. She had never in her life felt so small, so completely powerless. How had it come to this? How had a simple mistake led to her being treated like a criminal? Before she could protest any further, two officers, Officer John Carter and Officer Mark Davis, entered the store, their uniforms crisp and their expressions unreadable. They walked towards Margaret and the saleswoman, their footsteps heavy on the floor, amplifying the gravity of the situation. Margaret's eyes stung with unshed tears as the saleswoman launched into her account of the events, painting a picture of Margaret as a thief, her voice loud and accusing. "This woman tried to steal a diamond earring," the saleswoman declared, pointing a trembling finger at Margaret. "I caught her in the act." Margaret's hands were shaking as she tried to speak, but the officers barely acknowledged her. One of them turned to Margaret, his gaze cold and impersonal. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step forward," the officer said flatly, as if Margaret were just another case, another number. Margaret's knees felt weak beneath her, her body trembling in disbelief as she moved toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, this is a mistake. I didn't do anything." But her words were met with silence as the officer grabbed her arm, pulling her roughly to the side. Margaret gasped as the unexpected force made her stumble. The cold, hard metal of the handcuffs clamped around her wrists with a jarring finality, a sound that reverberated in the pit of her stomach. Margaret stood frozen, her mind reeling, her heart pounding in her chest. The realization hit her like a wave, the injustice of it all. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had simply admired an earring that had fallen. Yet here she was, shackled and humiliated, a criminal in the eyes of these strangers. Tears welled up in her eyes as the officers led her toward the door, their grips unyielding. She searched the room for any sign of compassion, but there was nothing. The saleswoman stood by, her eyes gleaming with a mix of triumph and contempt, watching as Margaret was escorted out of the store. As Margaret was dragged toward the door, the weight of the handcuffs on her wrists felt like a suffocating reminder of the injustice she was enduring. Her mind spun in disbelief, her thoughts racing, but she couldn't find a way to make the officers understand. It was as if the world had suddenly tilted, and the life she knew, the small comfort she'd felt within her son's store, was now shattered beyond recognition. Every step she took toward the exit felt like a step away from the truth, as if she were being erased, reduced to a stereotype she didn't recognize. But then, just as they reached the doorframe, the sound of an authoritative voice sliced through the air, halting everything in its tracks. What the hell is going on here? Margaret's heart skipped a beat. The familiar tone of her son Thomas flooded her with relief, and she turned her head toward the door. She saw him standing there, his expression a mixture of confusion and fury. His tailored suit, a little wrinkled from his rushed return, did nothing to soften the intensity of his presence. His eyes locked on Margaret, handcuffed and trembling, and a rush of protective anger seemed to surge through him. "Take those off her," Thomas ordered, his voice low and controlled, but undeniably commanding. The officers paused, their eyes flickering nervously between him and Margaret, uncertainty creeping in where confidence once stood. The tension in the room thickened, and for a moment the officers seemed frozen, unsure of how to proceed with this new development. But Thomas was undeterred. He moved forward, his steps firm and sure. The officers stood awkwardly, exchanging glances, but none of them made a move to remove the cuffs. "Are you okay, Mum?" Thomas's voice softened as he reached her side, his gaze filled with concern. His presence was like a shield, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Margaret felt a sense of comfort. She nodded weakly, though the tears threatening to spill from her eyes told a different story. "I didn't do anything, Thomas. It's all a mistake." Thomas's anger boiled over. He turned toward the saleswoman, who had been watching the entire scene unfold with a smirk. His eyes narrowed, his voice steely. "Vanessa Hart, care to explain why you thought calling the police on my mother was a good idea?" The saleswoman faltered, caught off guard by the shift in power. I didn't know it was your mother," she stammered, her voice shaky. "She dropped the earring, and I thought—" Her words trailed off, faltering in the face of Thomas's wrath. Thomas stepped closer, his gaze like a force that could not be ignored. "You thought what? That my mother, an elderly woman, would steal from this store?" His voice had risen now, full of raw emotion. "What gave you the right to make that assumption? To treat her like a criminal?" Vanessa Hart's face paled, and for the first time she seemed small and insignificant. Margaret stood quietly, feeling the weight of the moment sink in. The injustice she had faced, the humiliation, it all suddenly felt like a distant echo as she watched her son take charge. Thomas turned to the officers, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Do you even have any evidence she was stealing?" he demanded. "Or did you just blindly follow this woman's word because she assumed the worst about my mother?" The officers exchanged a tense look before one of them finally stepped forward. He removed the cuffs from Margaret's wrists, the sharp click of the metal echoing through the room. But even as the cuffs fell away, the humiliation and anger Margaret felt lingered. She rubbed her wrists, the sensation of the handcuffs still burning in her mind. Thomas didn't stop there. His focus turned back to Vanessa Hart, his expression unyielding. "You're fired," he said, his voice devoid of compassion. "I don't need people like you in my store." Vanessa Hart's face twisted in disbelief, but she didn't argue. Her shoulders slumped as she gathered her belongings, avoiding everyone's gaze. She fumbled with her purse, looking like she wanted to disappear. Finally, she left the store, her departure marked by the silence left in her wake. With the tension slowly lifting, Thomas turned to the officers. "I'll be filing a formal complaint," he stated firmly. "And you too owe my mother an apology. This never should have happened." The officers didn't offer much in the way of response, but one of them mumbled a quiet apology before turning to leave. Thomas didn't acknowledge them further, instead guiding Margaret to a nearby chair, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Mum," he said, his voice softening. "You didn't deserve any of this." Margaret looked up at him, her heart heavy but filled with pride. "I don't understand how it got this far," she said quietly. "This was supposed to be a safe place for us." Thomas nodded, his anger still simmering beneath the surface. "This ends now. We'll make sure this never happens again." The scene had shifted from one of humiliation to one of empowerment. Thomas's unwavering determination to defend his mother was a reminder of the strength that comes when you stand up for what's right, even in the face of prejudice and injustice. For Margaret, it was a lesson in resilience, in knowing that no matter how small the injustice, it was worth fighting back against. As the store slowly returned to normal, with customers filtering back in and the staff whispering amongst themselves, Margaret couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in that moment. What had started as an unjust accusation had been transformed into a call for accountability, one that would ripple far beyond the walls of Golden Grace. The room seemed to fall into an uneasy quiet after Thomas's words. Margaret sat in the chair, her hands still trembling slightly, but the anger that had clouded her mind earlier began to dissipate, replaced by a strange sense of resolve. She had her son by her side, and with him she felt the strength to face anything. The crowd, still standing by the windows, had begun to shift uneasily as they processed what had just unfolded. Some whispered, their voices a mix of sympathy and disbelief, while others exchanged glances, wondering what would happen next. It was as if the dynamic in the store had changed entirely, as if everyone had just witnessed a transformation, not just of Margaret's treatment, but of the way things should be. Thomas turned to Margaret, his face softening. "I'll take care of everything, Mum. Don't worry about this anymore." Margaret smiled weakly at him, grateful for his unwavering support, yet something gnawed at her. The anger hadn't quite left her. She felt it simmering beneath the surface, bubbling up as she thought about the saleswoman's sneer, the assumption of guilt simply because of her age and appearance. "What do we do now?" Margaret asked quietly. Her voice was steady, but the question was heavy. Thomas's gaze turned hard again, the fire he had displayed earlier not yet fully extinguished. "We take action. This ends now, not just for you, but for anyone else who could be wrongly accused. I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen again." He stood up, a fierce determination in his eyes as he walked toward the counter. The Lisa behind the register had remained silent throughout the entire ordeal, and now she seemed unsure of what role to play. She hesitated, but then started typing something into the register. "I'll handle the formal complaint against the officers," Thomas continued, his voice even. "And we're going to make sure Vanessa Hart never works in a place like this again." Margaret's heart swelled with pride. It wasn't just the store she had been worried about, it was the larger picture. She had seen her son build this business from the ground up, never once sacrificing his integrity, always standing by what was right. But now, it wasn't just about business anymore. This was about ensuring no one was ever treated the way she had been. No one else was made to feel small or invisible because of who they were. The weight of the moment seemed to settle between them as Thomas made the phone calls, his voice calm but steady as he arranged the necessary steps. Margaret could hear the murmurs of the staff behind the counter as they gathered information, whispering about the event, perhaps questioning their own reactions. She could tell that Thomas's words had not only shaken the saleswoman, but were reverberating through the entire store, reminding everyone of the importance of respect and accountability. Thomas returned to Margaret's side a few minutes later, his jaw set and his posture strong. "It's done," he said. "The formal complaints have been filed, and Vanessa Hart is officially terminated. She won't be working here again." Margaret felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. It wasn't about the punishment, not entirely. It was about the shift in power, the understanding that respect and dignity were the bedrock on which this store was built. The incident had shaken her, but it also gave her hope. This wasn't just about her. This was about a larger, systemic issue that needed to be addressed, and Thomas was stepping up to do just that. As the day continued, Margaret found herself reflecting on the many times she had walked into the store with pride, watching Thomas run the business with the kind of integrity that inspired loyalty from those who knew him. Thomas was determined to change that, to make sure his business, and by extension his community, became a place where respect, fairness, and dignity were upheld for everyone. As the last few customers trickled out, many casting curious glances toward Margaret, she knew the road ahead would be tough. But she also knew it would be worth it. One person standing up for what's right, like Thomas had done for her, could make all the difference. This small jewelry store in Portland, Maine, had become more than just a business. It had become a symbol of the change that was starting to ripple through the community. Margaret looked at Thomas and smiled again, a more genuine smile now. "You've made your mark, son. You've made a difference today." Thomas smiled back, his expression softening for a moment. "We've made a difference, Mum." The following days felt like a blur for Margaret and Thomas. The incident, still raw and fresh in their minds, had set off a chain of events that neither of them had anticipated. As the days passed, the shock began to wear off, replaced by a quiet determination. Margaret knew this wasn't just a personal battle anymore. It was about making a stand for all those who had been treated unfairly or been forced to face discrimination in silence. Thomas, too, felt the weight of it all. He wasn't just fighting for his mother, he was fighting for the very values that his store had been built on. The phone calls continued to pour in, customers, friends, and even strangers, expressing their support for Margaret and Thomas's decision to take action. Some praised Thomas's strength, others admired Margaret's composure, but one sentiment rang loud and clear. This was about more than just what had happened in that store. This was about standing up for what's right and setting an example. Thomas had spent the last few days working with his legal team, filing a formal complaint against the officers involved and beginning the process of holding Vanessa Hart accountable. But as much as the legal proceedings moved forward, Thomas knew that true change didn't just come from what happened in a courtroom. It came from shifting the culture, from making sure that the values of fairness, respect, and kindness were instilled in every corner of the store. He began organizing training sessions for the entire staff, focusing not just on customer service but on sensitivity, anti-discrimination practices, and how to create an environment where people felt safe and valued. Margaret watched with quiet pride as Thomas took control of the situation, working tirelessly to ensure that no one else would ever experience what she had. Her son wasn't just a businessman, he was a leader, one who understood that the real work was in creating lasting change. Meanwhile, Margaret's own healing process had begun. The scars of that humiliating day weren't easy to erase. She still found herself waking up at night with the sting of the handcuffs, her mind replaying the words the saleswoman had hurled at her. But each time those thoughts crept in, she reminded herself that this wasn't about dwelling on the past. It was about making sure that the future, for herself and for others, would be better. Margaret spent her days now slowly returning to the store, though with a new sense of purpose. She didn't just want to be part of Thomas's success anymore. She wanted to be a part of the bigger change that was unfolding in their community. She began reaching out to local leaders, organizing meetings and fostering conversations about prejudice, equality, and the need for accountability in businesses. Her voice, once soft and hesitant, grew stronger with every word. She was determined to make a difference, to ensure that no one, no matter who they were, was ever made to feel like they didn't belong. As Margaret and Thomas continued to process everything that had happened, a deep sense of gratitude washed over them both. Thomas had stood up for his mother in the most powerful way possible, and Margaret had stood tall, proving that even in the face of adversity, you could maintain your dignity. Together, they were reshaping their corner of the world, one small act of courage at a time. Thomas knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but as he watched his mother walk beside him, her head held high, he knew they had already made a lasting impact. Change didn't happen overnight, but it started with one person, one action, one voice. And for Margaret and Thomas, that was more than enough. They were committed to ensuring that what happened in that store would never be forgotten, and that the message of respect and accountability would echo through their community for years to come. The days following the trial felt like a slow, deliberate shift in the air. Margaret and Thomas had weathered the storm together, but the journey didn't end with the verdict. For Margaret, the feeling of vindication was tempered by the emotional weight of what had happened. While the legal system had worked in her favor, it couldn't undo the humiliation she had endured. The scars were still there, raw and aching, but as each day passed they began to fade, not because they were erased, but because Margaret had found a new purpose, one that involved not just healing, but pushing for change. Thomas, too, felt the weight of the experience, but for him the next chapter was about setting an example. He refused to let his mother's pain be in vain. The community had rallied behind them, but now it was time to take concrete steps toward ensuring that such injustice wouldn't occur again, not just in his store, but in any business in their town. The first thing Thomas did was reach out to local businesses, offering them the resources and training they needed to recognize and address bias. He wasn't interested in pointing fingers. He wanted to build bridges and create an environment where people understood that kindness and respect were not optional, but essential. He organized community forums where business owners and employees could discuss the importance of cultural sensitivity and diversity. Margaret, now fully embracing the role of advocate, attended these meetings, speaking openly about her experience and what it had taught her about the power of standing up for others. Meanwhile, Golden Grace Jewelers, once a place of simple elegance, had become a symbol of resilience. Margaret's story and Thomas's determination had transformed the store into a beacon for positive change. People from all over town, even those who had never set foot inside, now spoke of it with admiration. The once quiet shop was now filled with more than just customers. It was filled with a sense of hope, the kind that came from knowing that things could be better, that the community could do better. Margaret, at first hesitant, now found herself speaking at events, her voice steady, her message clear. She spoke of what it meant to face adversity and come out stronger on the other side. She spoke of the importance of compassion and fairness, of how easy it was to judge someone based on appearances, but how much harder it was to see the person behind the stereotype. Her voice, once shaken with doubt, now carried the weight of experience. One afternoon, as Margaret sat across from Thomas in his office, she reflected on the changes that had come about. It wasn't just the business that had transformed, it was the entire town. People had started asking questions about their own biases, about how they treated others, about how they could make the world a better place for everyone. Thomas had created more than just a business. He had created a movement. "Mum," Thomas said, his voice softening as he looked at her. "This is just the beginning. We've done something important here." Margaret smiled, the weight of the past few weeks settling into something more manageable, more empowering. "Yes," she agreed, her tone quiet but firm. "We've opened a door, and now it's up to all of us to walk through it." As the weeks passed, Margaret and Thomas became more deeply embedded in the movement for change. What had started as a personal ordeal was now a communal effort, and the ripples of their courage were felt far beyond the walls of Golden Grace Jewelers. Thomas's leadership had not only reshaped his business, but had also set a precedent for the entire town. His efforts to promote sensitivity training, create safe spaces for open dialogue, and make real, tangible changes in the way people interacted with one another were gaining traction. But it wasn't just about policies or programs. It was about fostering a culture that encouraged empathy and respect. Margaret, too, was changing. She was no longer the quiet woman who had merely walked into her son's store to share a lunch and witness his hard work. She had become an advocate, a voice that spoke for those who had been overlooked or mistreated, whether in business or in life. Her story, one of humility, dignity, and resilience, had touched so many, and now she found herself speaking at community meetings, leading the charge for broader social change. One afternoon, as Margaret stood before a crowd in the local community center, she realized just how far she had come. She spoke with passion and strength, her voice clear and confident as she told her story. But it wasn't just her experience she was sharing, it was a message to everyone in the room. "We all have the power to change," Margaret said, her hands resting lightly on the podium. "It's not about waiting for someone else to make the first move. Change starts with each of us, and sometimes it starts with a single moment of courage. I never imagined I'd be standing here today, but if my story can inspire even one person to do better, to treat others with kindness." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the audience. Margaret's journey had become more than just a lesson in resilience. It had become a beacon of hope for others who felt powerless, overlooked, or silenced. As the event concluded, people approached Margaret with gratitude in their eyes, thanking her for her courage and for showing them that change was possible. Thomas stood proudly by her side, watching as his mother once again turned a moment of hardship into a lesson that would resonate for years to come. Later that evening, as they sat together at dinner, Margaret looked at Thomas, a soft smile playing on her lips. "You know, I never thought something so awful would lead to all of this. But maybe that's the way life works. Sometimes the hardest moments bring out the best in us." Thomas reached across the table, taking her hand gently. "You've shown all of us what real strength looks like, Mum, and together we've made something good out of something bad." Margaret nodded, feeling a quiet sense of peace. She had lived a long life, filled with moments of struggle and triumph, but this was different. This wasn't just about enduring. It was about making a difference. "Change doesn't come overnight," she said softly, "but it starts with a single step, and together we've taken that step." The evening faded into the warmth of shared meals and quiet conversation. Outside, the world continued as it always had, but for Margaret and Thomas, everything had shifted. They had not only overcome adversity, but had forged a new path for the future, one where respect, kindness, and understanding could guide the way. And that, Margaret realized, was the greatest victory of all. This story offers valuable insights that can be applied to our current lives, especially in addressing prejudice, injustice, and the importance of standing up for what's right. In a world where people still face discrimination or unfair treatment, Margaret's experience shows the power of resilience and the need for personal courage. We all have moments when we may feel overlooked, misunderstood, or even unjustly accused, but it's essential to remember that standing firm in the face of adversity can make a real difference. From Margaret and Thomas's story, we can draw the lesson that it's not just about enduring mistreatment, it's about actively seeking change. Whether in our personal lives, workplaces, or communities, we must be willing to speak out against injustices, even when it's difficult. Supporting those who may be marginalized, questioning prejudiced behaviors, and advocating for fairness can help dismantle harmful systems and create a more compassionate world. In addition, Margaret's ability to find strength in vulnerability teaches us the importance of seeking help when needed. Change is rarely achieved alone. It often requires a community that stands together. Like Margaret, who found solidarity with her son and the support of her community, we too should seek out the power of unity when challenging systemic issues. Whether it's standing up for a colleague, speaking up in a meeting, or simply offering kindness, we all have a role in shaping a more just society.